My name is Whitney Shields. I am from the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems at Vermont Law School. First of all, a big thank you to Chief Nathan Perro. Also, a big thank you to the organizers of this event who have been so resilient and adaptable during this chaotic time. So Lauren is going to put on the PowerPoint that I put together. Great. So we are going to shift gears and discuss how a community can include food access in municipal plans and update zoning codes to increase food security. This is an important topic because many municipalities have prohibited people from growing their own food on their property, citing public health concerns. However, in the past 10 years, we have seen municipalities across the United States begin to include language in their municipal plans around food access, as well as amend or update their zoning codes to improve people's access to healthy foods. Next slide. Great. So that's me. I'm Whitney Shields. I am the postgraduate clinical teaching fellow. I am also the Vermont Legal Food Hub program coordinator. Next slide. Great. During this presentation, I will discuss the following items: review planning and zoning and its historical impact on marginalized communities, share what municipalities are doing to improve food access, opportunities in Vermont, and the conclusion. My goals for this presentation are to provide comprehensive information about municipal authority with a specific focus on zoning and planning, share national and local examples to encourage methods of implementing similar plans in your community if you haven't already, and look at another way to strengthen our local food system through law and policy. Next slide. So to begin with, I would like to do a quick overview of the authority given to municipalities. So municipalities may pass laws and regulations when they are authorized by the state government to do so. In fact, local governments often pass more stringent requirements than state law. Zoning and land use law are primarily state and local matters. However, federal law can limit state and local government land use regulations in some instances. And here are some just key terms to quickly review for the purposes of this presentation. Municipality, a city or town with corporate status and its own government. Statute, a law enacted by a legislative body. Ordinance, legislation enacted by a municipal authority. Regulation, how laws are implemented. Agencies develop, implement, and enforce regulations. Preemption, a situation where a law enacted by a higher authority, like the state, takes precedence over a law enacted by a local or a lower authority, which would be like a municipality. Next slide. So a municipal plan or comprehensive plan is developed by a planning committee to conceptualize long-term goals for the future development of their community. Municipal plans provides research, community input, land use recommendation, analysis, etc. The Planning Commission is responsible for preparing, updating, and distributing the plan. They will hold public hearings on the plan and submit it to the legislative body for consideration. And this image is from the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, and I think it really helps visualize how municipal plans are put in place step by step. So step 1 is community assessment. Step 2, develop a shared community vision. Step 3, identify community goals and objectives. Step 4, map out the future. Step 5, identify priority action items, implementation, and review. Next slide. Zoning can implement a municipal plan through regulatory schemes. Most zoning takes place at the city or town level, but county or regional laws may also regulate some of the same uses. Historically, zoning has been focused on separating uses of land that were deemed incompatible, such as urban land use from agricultural use. So if you see here, here is a list of different zoning districts and their allowed uses. Residential zoning allows predominantly housing. Industrial zoning allows industry and factories. Commercial zoning allows retail, wholesale, and financial businesses. Agricultural zoning is usually found outside of cities and allows large-scale crops and animals and livestock. Open space zoning, areas protected from development. Special zoning, such as power plants and stadiums. And then mixed-use zoning, and this allows uses that would usually be confined to separate zones, often includes mixed residential commercial uses, like what you see in downtown White River Junction. So to simplify it, planning serves as a foundation for zoning, and zoning is a method of implementing planning. Next slide, please. In regard to agriculture use, rural localities may worry that zoning may restrict agricultural productivity and reject zoning altogether. Urban areas are now more often being planned with mixed-use zoning in order to integrate commercial, residential, institutional, and agricultural uses. Unfortunately, zoning codes frequently restrict or prohibit agricultural activities, especially in residentially zoned areas, which decreases people's autonomy to grow their own food. Next slide. Historical local land use planning and zoning has created issues in the areas of environmental justice and food access. On the environmental end, for many years, federal policies reinforced local practices that limited housing for African Americans to less desirable areas adjacent to factories. Federally insured mortgages provided by the Federal Housing Authority shaped exclusionary practices by subsidizing the suburbs, thus proliferating race-based housing policies that continued well into the 1960s, and some would argue even today. Federal highway projects, as well as urban renewal policies, have often displaced and segregated African Americans into limited areas. And I have the image as an example of that. So this is 2 photos of Hastings Street, which is in Detroit, and was the main thoroughfare in a historic African-American neighborhood called Black Bottom. And so the image on the left was pre-1950s, and then the image on the right is post-1950s. And as you can see, the federal highway system completely removed that community. Next slide, please. So in regard to food access, zoning also impacts marginalized communities' access to healthy foods. For example, large grocery stores do not open their businesses in marginalized communities because they seek out areas close to high-paying clientele. Therefore, many of these communities only have fast food establishments, dollar stores, and convenience stores, which sell highly processed foods. This has caused a huge spike in diet-related illnesses, especially in communities of color. And I believe the graph on the slide really helps visualize that. This is a chronic disease death rates by race and ethnicity. And as you can see, diabetes, heart disease, and cancer are the highest in Black and African Americans. Next slide. So in an attempt to change historically harmful zoning, many US cities are updating zoning codes to minimize limitations on agricultural uses to increase residents' access to healthy food. Allowing residents to grow their own food or encouraging small growers to produce food in food insecure areas can increase access to healthy food. By ensuring that food production is properly regulated and managed, local governments can create a mixed-use land pattern that incentivizes healthy food production in all zones while ensuring community concerns and quality of life issues are addressed. Here are some tools to remove zoning barriers. Provide clarity on agricultural terms, specify which zones allow agriculture, allow on-site sale of produce whenever possible, allow for small animal husbandry, amongst many others. Next slide, please. Great. Provide clarity on agricultural terms. Without clear definitions, zoning codes may discourage food production through ambiguous language and unclear regulations. Potential growers may have a difficult time discerning what is allowed and refrain from producing food due to a fear of a possible violation or fine. So in Austin, Texas, what they have done is updated their ordinance to define various agricultural uses, including aquaponics, horticulture, and indoor crop rotation. And the image is of the North Austin Community Garden. Next slide, please. Specify which zones allow agriculture. If land use is not spelled out, growers may be hesitant to invest long-term or even start growing, as they may feel they can be ordered to stop growing at any time. And this has happened. I'm sure many of you have heard about that, not necessarily in Vermont, but in some variety of different areas throughout the United States. Naming the urban agriculture as a permitted land use gives more permanence and authority to growers. For example, in Detroit, Michigan, Detroit's ordinance includes agriculture terms and where agriculture is permitted. And that is an image of the Michigan Urban Farming Initiative. Next slide. Allow on-site sale of produce. Some zoning codes may not allow on-site sale of produce, which limits the ability for growers to sell produce with their neighbors and other consumers. Specifically, permitting on-site sale of farm products can increase access to healthy food to neighborhood consumers. So here's an example from Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Their municipal code specifies which products are allowed to be sold at a farm stand. Next slide. Allow for small animal husbandry. Restrictions on keeping animals can limit residents from producing additional food besides fruits and vegetables. Products like milk, eggs, and honey may be hard for consumers to find locally, especially in areas without access to fresh and affordable food. I do want to note here that prohibiting animal keeping can also disproportionately affect immigrant communities. One example is in Detroit. A Muslim community expressed a desire to produce halal meats. However, due to zoning codes, it is not permitted. But here's a positive from Boston, Massachusetts. Their zoning code sets provisions for keeping hens, bees, and it must include certain regulations, size, and animal limitations. Next slide, please. So let's talk about Vermont. So in Vermont, the state has given authority to municipalities to develop zoning bylaws, which they can elect to implement or not. Planning in Vermont. So there are 11 planning regions. Each region has a regional planning commission with a board of directors. Each region has a regional plan. Municipal plans are optional, but having an approved plan allows municipalities to participate in certain state and federal programs and access to funding sources. Municipal plans feed into regional plans, which help feed into state agency plans on topics as diverse as water quality, housing, and hazard mitigation. In Vermont, there are 213 municipal plans. In fact, 84% of municipalities have a plan. Next slide, please. So here's some case studies. There is a fantastic resource that was developed by Farm to Plate around local planning. And so these case studies are from that resource. So the first is from Washington County. Hunger Free Vermont's Council of Washington County, in partnership with the Central Vermont Regional Planning Commission, developed a mapping tool to identify food access barriers for community members. The goal was to identify potential opportunities to increase food access. Calais. They developed a self-sufficiency plan to increase, quote, an interest in growing and processing our own food to move towards food independence, end quote. And St. Albans in 2017 had in their city plan, they refer to health food access throughout their city plan. Next slide, please. So for more information about updating or amending zoning codes, please visit the Healthy Food Policy Project, or as we call it, HFPP. HFPP is a partnership between the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems at Vermont Law School, Rudd Center at the University of Connecticut, and Public Health Law Center. HFPP identifies and elevates local laws that seek to promote access to healthy food, while also contributing to strong local economies, an improved environment, and health equity, with a focus on socially disadvantaged and marginalized groups. A lot of the information that I presented to you today is actually from the resource that here's a screenshot of it on the slide. And I want to do a special shout out to the author. Her name is Tess Romanaski. She's a master's student at Vermont Law School, and she developed this resource for HFPP. Next slide. And here are some additional resources. I want to point out specifically the first two resources in the first column. Like I mentioned, the Healthy Food Policy Project and the Farm to Plate resource on local planning. These two resources have a variety of information around local planning and examples of innovative local policies. I think especially now during the pandemic, it's really important to support our local food systems and supply chains in the midst of what's happening right now. I believe you should be able to click the blue font, and that will take you to the page if any participants are interested in doing that. And then the next slide. I hope that in this presentation, I provided comprehensive information about municipal authority with a specific focus on zoning and planning, shared national and local examples to encourage methods of implementing similar plans in your community if you haven't done so already, and looked at another way to strengthen our local food system through law and policy. So I will open it up to questions.
Hi, I am trying to unmute Anna so she can ask you some questions.
Yeah, I just accepted the request. Great. So one question that I have for you is, you talked about, I think it was Washington County, developing a mapping tool to identify food access barriers. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, what specifically were they mapping?
So I can also share the resource, and it may be on Hunger Free Vermont's website, so I highly recommend going there if anyone is interested. Essentially, what they had realized in Washington County that a lot of community members were food insecure, and so they really wanted to figure out, okay, so what are the gaps? Why can't consumers connect to healthy foods? And so that tool was really just looking at those gaps and bringing them together to notify, you know, the Municipal Planning Commission that, hey, this is kind of the situation we have, and these are the gaps that we have, in the hopes that they could increase food access either through community work or through a legislative process. I hope that answered your question.
And do you know, just a follow-up question, do you know what or what kind of data they were collecting? Like, was it like a survey that they were gathering information? Were they tracking how many miles families are traveling to get food?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually don't know what type of data that they collected. However, I can send that information to the group. And also, if you go to the resources page on the PowerPoint, the local planning guide that Farm to Plate put together, they actually feature Washington County in this initiative in their case studies.
Great, thank you. Webinar. All right, so we do have a few other questions. Can you speak about land access agreements concerning easements for hunting and gathering, and specifically how a landowner can attach such an easement to their land?
I actually don't have any real expertise knowledge on land use agreements. I do know we had put together, or in the process of putting together, a resource for the Healthy Food Policy Project, looking at hunting, foraging, and fishing in the state of Vermont. We actually met with the Department of Fish and Wildlife to get an understanding of, you know, how exactly that it looks in Vermont and how we can increase access for food security purposes. But I can't talk to, I really can't, I don't feel comfortable providing any kind of information on that. I'm not really an expert there.
But it's good to know that other people are looking into this and seeing what how they can make this a reality and adopt some best practices. Okay, question is, can you talk about how towns and regions can ensure land or food sovereignty? And question was from Kat. She's thinking about a town in Maine.
Yeah, so I know what you're talking about. I forget the name. I think it's Unity in Maine. And they put together a really comprehensive plan on food sovereignty that really came from the ground up. And I can share the link with all of you so you can see some of the language. But essentially, food sovereignty is an international movement that is still relatively new to the United States. And so you have a few folks or communities in New England who are trying to implement this at the local level. Anna, can you repeat your question again? That was just my intro to it.
Yeah, sure. It's talk about how towns and regions can ensure land and or food sovereignty. Yeah,
and so that's complicated. The town in Maine, had a ton of support from the community, but when it came to actually passing some legislation around it, there is a lot of pushback. One thing that they ran into, one kind of barrier was around slaughtering, because a lot of people wanted to be able to raise and slaughter on their own property. And so there are a lot of barriers. I'm not aware of any perfect model out there. So I definitely would do some research into what's going on in Maine. If anyone is interested in putting food sovereignty, plan together, I know that Berry City has a food sovereignty resolution that is really, really exciting to see. I know there's some other local communities in the state of Vermont that have passed similar resolutions, but in regards to having something with teeth, Maine has that food sovereignty, legislation, but it's getting a lot of pushback. And so I think it's important to kind of read up on that and see what are the barriers. So if you are interested in really giving teeth to a resolution in your community, you can see what barriers you may run into.
Great, and that's what I was thinking about as well. And a lot of the things that you were talking about is actions that would need to be enacted by municipalities and not necessarily as citizens, but we do have the ability to put forward resolutions on the town agendas. So I think that would be really great to look at how Berry has been moving that forward.
Agreed, yeah.
And a question from the audience, can you explain what food sovereignty is?
Yeah, so I mean, there are like so many different definitions that are out there. And I think, even if you do like a quick Google search, you're gonna have at least 50 different definitions pop up. But essentially, I think it's important to realize food sovereignty is a term that was coined by the members of Via Campesina, and this was in the 1990s. And it essentially asserts that people who produce, distribute, and consume food should control the mechanisms and policies of food production and distribution.
Great, thank you for that clarification. And one more question from Kat. Can you talk, a few more questions. All right, so let's see. There's one from Benjamin, so I'll let him go first. What's your take on the potential for technology in helping to address food deserts, with hydroponics and aeroponics becoming big business near some suburban areas? I'm curious if it's getting more affordable to leverage those ideas to help more food grow where it isn't currently. So using those technologies to address food deserts.
Yeah, so in the resource that I talked about, that the Healthy Food Policy Project around zoning ordinances, we had a methodology that we used to identify the most innovative ordinances that have been passed. And I'm not aware of anything that focused on specifically technologies. And so it's really hard to say how it's helping with food security, because it's relatively new. And looking at food deserts, it seems as though there needs to be more research and more data compiled to really see how it's able to help with food security. This is a generalization, but a lot of these technologies tend to be housed in more like hip places, in more gentrified neighborhoods. Though we do see in places like New Orleans, Louisiana, they are trying to advance these technologies in marginalized communities. But we don't really know how much it's really advancing food security at this point. It'd be a great project though, Ben, if you're interested.
And since we're on the topic, would you mind defining food deserts for people? In my head, I'm thinking about places where just like food isn't available, but I'm also thinking in a lot of the areas that we live by a lot of farms. So maybe it's not necessarily that food isn't produced near where we live. More we can do food deserts.
Sorry, you cut out just a little bit there, but just what is it, essentially defining what a food desert is?
Yes, if you can define food deserts.
Okay, great. So I do want to point out that the term food desert, which is recognized by the USDA and by many of us, is actually something that a lot of community organizers, especially people of color, want to redefine as food apartheid. And so I'd like to give you that definition first. And essentially food apartheid is a form of apartheid because in most cases it's the lack of availability of healthy food, which disproportionately affects communities of community of color. So it's essentially whole communities are geographically and economically isolated from healthy food options. So I just want to throw that out there to the group. Karen Washington, who I don't know if you can see the poster behind me, but she, when I was a student for Vermont Law School, she came up and talked about a lot of the food justice that she's been doing. And she was the first one to kind of introduce that to all of us. But essentially going back, defining food desert is essentially an area, urban or rural, where it's really difficult to be able to afford nutritional food at all times.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to follow up on another question. Can you talk about some laws that need to be done for of land and water?
Sorry, sorry, I don't know if it's my connection, your connection, but some food law.
To be undone for actual sovereignty of land and water.
Food law to be undone to support food sovereignty.
Not necessarily food laws. The examples there are water and septic.
Okay, so if I understand the question, essentially changing regulations around water and septic to improve access to food, essentially?
Yes, not necessarily limited to water and septic, but just generally what are some laws that can be undone?
You know, that's a hard one because public health is the primary focus for any municipality. And so when you look at zoning and the different uses, you're not going to loosen any kind of zoning codes that will let schools be built next to a factory, for example, or in regards to agriculture, having agriculture near factories. So I think it's important to realize there's not an actual perfect system for how to do this. It's also very hard to change the law. Updating and amending it is possible, but and also passing new zoning ordinances can help, but with the current laws, I mean, it's pretty difficult to change because, again, the primary concern for municipalities is public health. And if there's, when it comes to animal husbandry, for example, there's a lot of pushback in a lot of communities because of nuisance, as well as concerns of waste and it, running off into other people's properties and into the water system. So yeah, I'm not aware. I'm sure it exists, but from the research we've done, I can't say that we've come across any laws that were going to impact public health in any way.
All right, thank you, Whitney.